Hello and welcome to the Cold Spring Harbor Library and Environmental Center's second historical presentation. In honor of April being National Poetry Month, this presentation is about Jupiter Hammon, a man who is arguably the most famous poet to have lived in the borders of what would become Lloyd Harbor, Cold Spring Harbor, or Laurel Hollow, which is to say the areas our library serves. However, unlike the first historical presentation, which was on Rosalie Gardner Jones, this presentation will be far shorter in just an overview of his life, as well as some links to his works, which now fall within public domain. The reason for this difference is that there is simply nowhere near the amount of information about Jupiter Hammon in existence as there is about Rosalie Gardner Jones. Nevertheless, hopefully this short presentation will illuminate Jupiter's life sufficiently enough to get an understanding of who he was beyond that of what is often repeated, namely being the first published poet of African descent in the Americas and a lifelong slave. Lastly, my name is Scott, and I am a reference librarian at the Cold Spring Harbor Library, at which I oversee the development of our history and science collections. I mentioned my focus on history and science because it is a fundamental part of my personality to seek out the truth about both our universe and our species, regardless of any emotional attachment to previously held ideas and beliefs, or the comfort that they can provide. There might be information or perspectives conveyed in this presentation that could be seen as controversial by some, but I hope all those who watch this realize that their inclusion is intended to help us honestly question our own previously held beliefs, which in turn is the first genuine step towards finding the truth. I must also emphasize that any opinions or comments stated by me are mine alone and not that of the Cold Spring Harbor Library, its board, or any other employees therein. My intent is not to offend, but to challenge. Now, on to the presentation. If one were to perform an internet search about Jupiter Hammon, what is typically found are his poetry, a variety of relatively shallow biographical information, and two photographs of different men, one young and one old. As such, the information about him is limited, sometimes misleading and outright fabrication. Take, for example, the aforementioned two photographs that come up when searching for Jupiter Hammon. Put simply, neither are of Jupiter, despite being displayed over and over again by websites about him. Jupiter Hammon died in 1806, decades before practical photography existed. A reverse image search will reveal that the younger gentleman, pictured here, is late 19th century poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, while the other one is probably the slave-turned-whaler Pyrrhus Conker. As an aside, Conker was notable in his own right for the sensation he made in Japan a decade before Commodore Perry's forced entry into that country after Conker's crew brought some shipwrecked Japanese sailors home. The lack of a face to put on Jupiter is just one of several aspects about him that have caused some who are uncomfortable with the unknown to undertake writing conjectural biographies to fill the void, as opposed to accepting an uncertain reality or potentially unpalatable viewpoints. Like a partially filled glass, what dominates the story of Jupiter Hammon is the empty space. What we know of Jupiter Hammon is obviously therefore relatively limited. Jupiter was born on October 17, 1711, and spent his whole life as a slave for the Lloyd family of what is now Lloyd Harbor, New York. Although there is some uncertainty over who his parents were, baptismal records suggest two of the Lloyd family slaves by the names of Obium and Rose were his father and mother respectively. Some records state his father's name was actually Opium, but the baptismal records clearly state it as Obium. Jupiter had 3 or 4 owners throughout his long life, all being members of the Lloyd family. Jupiter's first owner, Henry Lloyd, took the unusual step of giving him the rare gift of an education, administered by the Anglican Church's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Although now the Americas don't seem like so-called foreign parts, in the pre-Revolutionary War era, the 13 colonies were indeed seen by the English in their Anglican Church as such. It appears that Jupiter's education may not have been entirely unique for a Lloyd family slave, as Jupiter was gifted a book of Psalms by his father Obium, suggesting that he too might have been able to read. Either way, Jupiter apparently proved himself proficient in literacy as the Lloyd family went on to utilize his skills as a clerk and bookkeeper. Besides Jupiter's contributions to the Lloyd family's business ventures, he also eventually became a respected preacher to the local slaves as well. Jupiter's devout religious views would heavily influence his future published works. All of his writings are thoroughly steeped in Christian phrasing and metaphors. Indeed, Jupiter's poems appear as though they would fit comfortably in the Book of Psalms itself. At any rate, the first of his works was written on Christmas Day, 1760, and published in 1761, when Jupiter was roughly 50 years old. This work, An Evening's Thought, Salvation by Christ and Penitential Cries, was published on what is known as a broadside, which were large sheets of paper often utilized as posters, advertisements, flyers, and the like, between roughly the 1500s and the 1800s. A few years later, after the death of Jupiter's first owner, Henry, Jupiter's ownership appears to have gone to one of Henry's sons, either Henry II or Joseph. While it is certain that Joseph eventually owned Jupiter, it is unclear if Henry II also did before the Revolutionary War. It is this uncertainty that accounts for why it is stated earlier that Jupiter had either 3 or 4 owners in his life, all dependent on whether Henry II was at some point Jupiter's owner or not. Soon, the American Revolution split the family's loyalties between revolutionaries and the British. Henry II, the owner of the Lloyd Manor, was a loyalist to the British crown, but his brother Joseph and one of Joseph's nephews, John, were both revolutionaries who sailed to Connecticut with Jupiter in tow after the British occupied Long Island in 1776. It was during this time in Connecticut that Jupiter would write several more of his works. In 1778, a full 18 years following his first work, Jupiter wrote an address to Miss Phillis Wheatley, who was a female slave born in Africa that recently had some of her poetry published in London, is widely recognized as the first published Black female author. The same year, Jupiter published The Kind Master and Dutiful Servant. 2 years later, Jupiter's third master, Joseph, apparently committed suicide when he erroneously believed the war was lost following the fall of Charleston in 1780. Jupiter's ownership then passed to Joseph's nephew, John. Another 2 years would follow before Jupiter's next work, called Poem for Children with Thoughts of Death. With the end of the war in 1783, John and Jupiter returned to the Lloyd Manor on Long Island. John would take ownership of the property after Henry II was run out of the country, along with most loyalists, who predominantly migrated to Canada. 4 years later, in 1787, Jupiter would write his longest and most famous work. It was not a poem, but an address to the inaugural meeting of the African Society in New York City, entitled An Address to Negros in the State of New York. Despite then being already a ripe age for the time at 75, Jupiter is thought to have lived a further 20 years before dying in roughly 1806 at the remarkable age of 94 or 95. It is believed he was buried in an unmarked grave on the Lloyd Manor property. In addition to the attested works by Jupiter, 2 other works have recently been credited to him. The viewpoints described in at least one of those works is markedly different from his known works, and because of this has been called into question by some after having been found in the Yale archives. It is also described as being in perfect conditions after 200 years, and that it is either the real thing or a great hoax. Several traits, such as its condition and contrasting opinions, suggest it is indeed a forgery. Probably for the same reason that nearly half the surviving medieval European documents are believed now to be forgeries. Because possessing a document of supposed antiquity supporting a point of view or claim being made by someone in the present is a major help for the latter's case. The most famous example of this is the donation of Constantine, which was a document claiming that Emperor Constantine handed the authority of Rome over to the Pope during his reign, but instead is known to have been written centuries later by clerics during a period of conflict over whether the church or the state had greater authority in Europe. Whereas the forgery of a document claiming to be written by Jupiter Hammon, obviously it does not bestow the forger with expansive power or authority like the donation of Constantine would have. It could allow a historical figure with troublesome views better fit a desired narrative. Whether the document is a forgery or is genuine, and its difference in viewpoints being attributed to self-censoring or censoring by others in previous works is unclear. In other words, this difference of viewpoints might be because of the fact that he was being honest in that text that has been hidden away, whereas the viewpoints that he in his published works had to first pass through other hands. So for example, if the latter, it is important to remember that his published works had to pass through the hands of and be approved by white editors and publishers whose viewpoints were likely either supportive or at least indifferent to slavery. Making sense of Jupiter Hammon's views on slavery is therefore a bit complex. At face value, his undisputed works seem to suggest he was at least indifferent to being a slave. Jupiter repeatedly suggested that in some ways his and also Phillis Wheatley's enslavement was a blessing, as it allowed them to be exposed to the true word of God and Jesus, whereas staying in Africa would have meant that they and their ancestors would have remained heathens. Though this could have been an extreme form of searching for a silver lining in a difficult situation, as opposed to outright gratitude. Jupiter also stated in his address to Negroes in the state of New York that whereas he himself has no interest in being freed, he can understand the wish of the younger generations for freedom and hopes they eventually get it. However, he is quite clear that in the meantime, he believes that slaves should do their jobs to the best of their ability, and that if they are not freed in this life, that their reward will come to them in the kingdom of heaven. These views can seem hard to reconcile with modern sensibilities, but can be better understood when considering the uncertainties of daily life in the 18th century. With regards to his disinterest in personally being freed, one should remember he was roughly 70 years old at the time of his writing on this subject, and in an age before social welfare, facing the new challenges of freedom may have seemed more daunting to him than the familiar ones of slavery. A sad but relevant example of this that Jupiter might have been fully aware of is that of Phillis Wheatley, the same individual he dedicated one of his poems to. After Phillis Wheatley's book of poems was published, she was freed by her owners, who in turn appear to have died within a couple of years. Phillis subsequently married a free Black grocer named John Peters and fell into poverty. She lost 2 of her children in childbirth. Her husband was in prison for debt, and she worked as a scullery maid at a boarding house to support her 3rd child before dying at the young age of 31, and her infant son sadly dying shortly after. Regarding being rewarded in the next life for hardships in this one, if one considers the history of Christianity, it is not hard to make sense of. Extending back to Roman times, Christianity was often most popular with the poor and the slaves. Considering how hard a slave's life can be, whether they are picking crops in antebellum South, breaking rock in the iron mines of the Roman Empire, or any era in between, many found hope in the idea of freedom in the next life when hope of it in their current one seemed unlikely. Jupiter was merely one of the last in a long line of slaves who held the similar views throughout much of history. There have been some efforts to attach a metaphorical meaning to Jupiter Hammon's writing in support of emancipation in recent years by some revisionists. But if the disputed document is indeed a forgery, that is to say the one that is called Essay of Slavery, as seen lower here, the argument for such an overwhelmingly unconvincing and appear to be more of a reflection of the modern author's views than that of Jupiter himself when assessed in the context of the times of education. In other words, the entire idea of him being against slavery kind of rests on whether or not the essay on slavery is genuine or forgery. And really, that's kind of up in the air at this point. Regardless, one should never base their views about a topic solely from the words of others. So links to all of Jupiter Hammon's verified works and one disputed work, as I mentioned here, are provided here for your discernment and hopefully enjoyment. And as always, thank you for taking an interest in this topic, and I hope you have happy reading.